Okay, it's the 9th of November, 2021. This is Critical Thinking. What's that echo? Yeah. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my research, and I'm going to present it in the style of a research paper discussion, and I prepared slides so that you can follow along. It means quite a lot of reading today. Sorry about that. Less jokes and stuff like that. But you need to pay attention today and read on the screen. I'm going to talk about Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and Karl Marx, and try and approach them in a different way that focuses critically and, trying to be creative. The course is critical thinking, but I also want to do it in what I think are more interesting ways. I'm going to focus on the diary or the notebook or letters, kind of peripheral or secondary text to the main texts of Marx and I suppose Gandhi, although there's not really a main text of Gandhi. And to connect with you, I want to talk about writing diary writing. You know, a diary, you write in it every day. It's not a toy, although when we're probably our first diaries, it's something like a toy. You write down every day. A diary doesn't have to be daily activity, although it can be. And today we often, very often, have something like a diary in our weblogs and social media pages and things like that, where we are kind of recording more or less consciously our daily thoughts, and there's a way in which these can be used for critical thinking. Okay, what I'm thinking about is that the typed form of diary is not a terrible form, but there's something in the writing of it, maybe the typing of it, but the handwritten nature of a diary that allows, it's more conducive to kind of self-consciousness about thinking. Okay, so Gandhi and Marx. I'll start with a big quote. And it's from Vinoba Bhave. He's a Gandhian follower of Gandhi. He had a very interesting project to get land for the landless, gifted from the bourgeoisie, from the capitalists. But anyway, and he traveled all over India doing this for most of his life. Bhave, whatever interest the world may or may not take in the comparative study of Gandhi and Marx, in our own country at least, it's become a subject of everyday discussion among the educated. Every discourser attempts to weigh Gandhi and Marx and measure them up according to his capacity. So we may often think that there have been far too many wild comparisons and mild contrasts between Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma, it means great soul, right? And Karl Marx. And any effort to even begin to summarize their positions in terms that would allow an overall evaluation is a bit crazy. It's fraught with problems. And anyway, the applicability of such big generalizations is hardly decisive. But I can give you a plan of what I'm going to try and do. An impossible task. I propose instead to come at it at a different angle a workaround that may maybe reclaim scholarship that surrounds the reified focus on only the general and the programmatic. Reading the letters and prefaces, the peripheral apocrypha, the side texts, you could call that, of the Marxian text, the notebooks, as they're published volume by the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, and the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, as well as his diary, the autobiography, and other texts that I can access. What I want to do is focus not on the general versions of Gandhi and Marx that we know, but on what they wrote in unguarded moments, right? So in their letters, in their diary, when they're writing sort of to themselves, Mahatma Gandhi is writing his own diary for his own clarification, although he's probably also thinking of publication, by the end anyway. And although it's not a diary, Marx writing nearly every day to Engels in the plan. The categories that I take up are many: control, modern industry, dialectics, revolutionary violence, women, technology, class oppression, religion, of course the opium of the people, right? Fascism, and reading. Any assessment of debates then from the perspective of now, debates back then from the perspective of now, is conditioned by the point from which we observe. We will interpret old debates with questions now. So this paper that I'm going to present emphasizes how a diary is the introspection of a diary and of letters that can share almost anything without censure. I mean, of course, when you write a letter, you do censor yourself, but less so, perhaps. And in these letters and in diary, we can see from these great thinkers, them testing out ideas with themselves, offering ideas as they're first formed, the first sketches of what will eventually be published. And they're written without the intent to publish. Letters are meant for the ear of the confidant, right? You only write. Of course, in those days, you had a version of copy and paste. You would perhaps sometimes send a letter you received from someone on to another friend to say, see what Engels has written to me, blah, blah, blah. And Marx and Engels did include letters from other people in their exchange, but they're largely intimate and unguarded in the sense of, like when you write in a diary, when you write in a letter, you're not writing first for publication. Even if you become famous, you know eventually your letters will be published. So these are draft scripts looking at first thoughts. They, of course, are never scripture, right? The first thoughts aren't, there's no need to invoke some interpretive or liturgical hermeneutic excess. The uses we make of editing, selecting, translating, excerpting, and erasing passages and paragraphs are really key. In fact, if you look at letters or diary entries or notebooks and compare them to the finished public text, you see vast differences. And you can see how the thought process works. Sometimes. Now, we, of course, want to avoid any dogmatic, stereotype, grand theory Marx. That's always my task. And be aware that Mahatma Gandhi has also been subject to a kind of caricature in so many misrepresentations, even from Tagore through to the Edinburgh film Gandhi, or more recently in Viceroy's House, filmed by Gurunda Chadha, deeply problematic. But both Gandhi and Marx wanted to change the world, not just interpret it. Both had an increasing and evident sense of mission. Both raised the spectre, the spectre of massed power of the oppressed and the imperative of collective endeavour. They were for a politics of self-determination, an alienated life and a future untrammelled by the evils of capital and exploitation. Gandhi and Marx are the names for a desire for freedom. Both work it out in their own textual ways. Gandhi kept a diary. Mahatma Gandhi kept a diary throughout his adult life. His critical thinking is expressed in this diary form. At least since his first trip to London, when he first went as a student of law. The first volume of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, after 3 small notes, a confession, a short graduation speech, and a letter to his mother, the first substantial text is his London diary. Gandhi advised his satyagrahis. Satyagrahis, they are the followers of Gandhi. Right, his devoted activist troops, the ones who will follow what he says to do and put themselves in the face of danger non-violently to oppose the British. He advised his satyagrahis to keep a diary, which would be, quote, a mirror of your own mind, recording your thoughts and dreams, good and bad. His idea was a diary was a tool for critical self-reflection. A prospective satyagrahi is expected to keep a logbook or diary in which he will daily enter the work done during the course of the day, and the logbook shall be submitted to me, Gandhi said. So he wanted to see that his followers were thinking critically. There are some problems with that, of course. A leader who gets to see every thought of a follower. But Gandhi's publication of his apparent innermost diary self was for public reading. Politics for him was not based on a public-private division. So he wasn't embarrassed about or shy about the private nature of these thoughts. And writing diary for him was consciousness raising. Consciousness raising, this is a phrase related to critical thinking, but it's one that has its own little history. It was very big and fashionable in the 1960s in America with the civil rights movement and the student movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Consciousness raising and the hippies, right? Talking to each other and learning to get past the prejudices of sexism, racism. And it fell out of fashion, I suppose, in the 80s and 90s, but in the left, in England at least, around a group called Plan C, it came back, and the work of Mark Fisher, who sadly died a couple of years ago. Mark Fisher spoke a lot about it, returning to what was good about consciousness raising. That was working with each other to work through issues of assumptions and critique. And I think in some ways the notebooks we keep when we are students or scholars are something like this kind of diary, in that they are where you put critical reflection and you think through those first ideas. And you don't do it for publication, so it should be a bit more free, possible, potential. So it's the effort to increase and emphasize forms of conscious self-activity. This would be the greater contribution to the democratic process and democratic participation for Gandhi than any vote block, tick box, vote on this stamp, patronage, or corruption of any democratic official voting system. In his autobiography, Gandhi wrote of diary writing that the exercise has given me ineffable mental peace because it has been my fond hope that it might bring faith in truth and ahisma to waverers. Ahisma, truth and the path of peace. Gandhi is not to be made into some kind of god, right? He's been criticized by Bipin Chandra. He said, while Gandhi brought the masses into political movement, he never encouraged or permitted the masses to discuss and develop political activity. I think that can be also questioned as well, the way in which Gandhi is criticized there. Because with this diary writing, this effort to demonstrate critical thinking, there is an encouragement for the masses to discuss and develop political activity on their own. Leave alone, Bipin Chandra continues, leave alone to encourage them to have their own leadership. Well, yeah, that's possibly a more powerful critique. But Gandhi here is an advocate not just of literacy, but of reflective, contemplative self-examination. That's his leadership, and that's not nothing. Marx, of course, we know he kept no diary, but we have almost daily correspondence that he kept up with Friedrich Engels for nearly 50 years. It's an archive of the political issues of the day, of the whole second half of the 19th century, or the middle of the 19th century, really, from the 40s to the 80s. And we can see in those letters, really explicitly, the first, often second and third, attempts to nut out ideas that they worked through together. A kind of dialogue and discussion that eventually became the texts that are fixed as Marx. I'm suggesting that in this exchange with Engels, like in the diary writing of Gandhi, you can see self-conscious, self-critical thinking, the process of thinking. And that's something to learn from that. The letters have plenty of significant points. For example, the famous letter to Arnold Rouge, written in 1843, where Marx asserts the task of the communists is the ruthless criticism of all that exists, the ruthless, which will be ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of the conflict with the powers that be if you express that criticism. I mean, that's a great definition or criteria for critical thinking. A ruthless criticism of everything that exists, so long as it included Marx and Engels, yeah, in Gandhi's self-critical sense, there's really something powerful there. That letter is rightly celebrated, of course, but there are so many others where he says important things. Another famous letter by Marx, he writes towards the end of his life, actually. So he writes to the Russian newspaper Otesensivnia Sapinsky, pointing out that the journal, this newspaper, should not take his book Das Kapital and allow its writers to, quote, metamorphose my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historical philosophical theory of the general march imposed by fate upon every people, whatever the historical circumstances. Marx was upset in this letter, which is rightly questioned, that they were turning his historical study of capitalism in England into a model to be applied to all societies. And he had said in the introduction, this book is for readers, for example, German readers, to learn something of the process because something similar will be happening to you, but you will need to do the work using these concepts to work out just how it's playing out in your circumstance. He quotes, he says it more elegantly than that. He quotes Virgil and Horace actually. The names may be changed, but the story is told of you. This is a quote from Horace. But that letter to the newspaper, Russian newspaper, it was in the context of the Russians wondering if, because Russia wasn't an advanced capitalist society, could it have the kind of development and revolution that would be consistent with Marxian theories, given that the theories were based on advanced capitalism in England, and capitalism wasn't that advanced in Russia. Of course, we see eventually, and Marx was learning this and anticipating this as well. He'd learned Russian in the last years of his life, of course, that the revolution would actually happen elsewhere in Europe, but actually in Russia, as it did first with Lenin. Of course, this was many years before then. But that historical sketch shows, the process in Europe. He calls it at one point a historical sketch. Sorry. The historical sketch describes the historic movement which by divorcing the producers from their means of production converts them into wage earners, proletarians in the modern sense of the word. And that's Marx describing his overall plan. So yeah, in other places, in the colonial sphere, for example, it's also true that separating the producers from the means of production turns them into wage earners or slaves or oppressed peasants and so on. I mean, the circumstances, though, are different, and it requires a thinker, a critical thinker, and a leader or a party with leaders and a critical approach to work out what are the particular circumstances for their situation. So Lenin for Russia, Mao for China, Ho Chi Minh for Vietnam, right? If you read his book, The Revolutionary Path, Dung Kak Men, you see him working out the particular circumstances for Vietnam, in which opium features hugely, right? Not the case so much in England. Although, other letters that Marx wrote, he had some fun as well, of course. He wrote a letter in the second last year of his life, when he went to Algeria. Marx went to Africa for the first time the year before he died, right? He was 82. In 1882. He was 72. 71. He writes anyway from Algeria a letter to his daughter, and he signs off with an Orientalist fable. And I've not yet traced where he got this from, but it's one surely that Mahatma Gandhi would have loved. A ferryman is ready and waiting with his small boat on the tempestuous waters of a river, and a philosopher, wishing to get to the other side, climbs on board. There ensues the following dialogue. The philosopher: do you know anything of history, ferryman? The ferryman says, no. The philosopher, he says, then you've wasted half your life. And again, the philosopher said, have you studied mathematics, ferryman? And the ferryman says, no. The philosopher says, then you've wasted more than half your life. Hardly were these words out of the philosopher's mouth, then the wind capsized the boat, precipitating the ferryman and the philosopher into the water, whereupon the ferryman shouts out, philosopher, can you swim? And the philosopher says, no. The ferryman says, then you've wasted your life, your entire life. Karl Marx to Laura Lafarge, his daughter, April 13, 1882. Marx was, some people say Marx was losing it in the last 10 years of his life. He didn't finish Capital, right? He only published volume 1 and volume 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 remained undone. But it's here clear that he's still got his wits about him, thinking about philosophy. And actually now that the notebooks are being published, some 30,000 foolscap B4 pages of densely written notes that Marx took in the last 10 years of his life. 30,000 pages of notebooks just being slowly published now in the Mega. We were getting to see that he was still pursuing the research interests in land ownership, in Asiatic forms of land ownership, the potential of revolutionary movements, but in sciences, in mathematics, and several other languages, still working very hard to get the tools needed to write that Capital. But yeah, they're only being published now because for a long time, orthodox Marxists, I suppose, had said, well, you know, the key work is Capital and volumes 1, 2 and 3, and the rest is periphery. Well, the periphery sounds pretty interesting to me. You see, I've got these on the slides, these stamps. I picked them because both Marx and Gandhi are celebrated in philately, the study of stamps, and by the by. Okay, some topics that they are similar on. Gandhi and Marx, according to Bill Grummy, both instinctively appealed to the same idea in their critical thought, the concept of an unalienated life. Like Gandhi, Marx stressed, 1, the objectification of the relations between nature and human beings, such that nature was not seen any longer as promoting their practical and moral engagement, living in nature, but rather seen as the object of their detached and extractive gaze, mastery and control. 2, the objectification of the relations between human beings themselves. I mean, these are the key concepts of Capital. Gandhi seeks to shape an Indianized version of a non-violent socialism consistent with what is claimed to be Marx's basic principle of communism. To each according to his need, from each according to his capacity. Now that slogan has also been a feature in many other places, of course, as you well know. But it's not just on the main concepts that they have some similarity. On dialectics, the theoretical concepts, the point's really to learn something from Gandhi so as to renew and reclaim scholarship and understanding of Marx, and similar, vice versa, to learn something from Marx to re-examine Gandhi. Right? Both have been buried under a kind of avalanche of commentary, even a hagiography. Right? There's too many texts that will tell you this is how to read Marx, this is what Gandhi means, rather than leaving it for people to read and find out for themselves, to have a look for themselves, if you remember another course. And critical thinking has to be that, really. You have to be able to learn something from the scholarship that's gone on before, but also to try and at the same time, this is dialectics, to ignore what you've read about something so you can read that thing for yourself. Right? And that's where there's no shortcuts in scholarship, because we have far too many pages, primers, textbooks, Wikipedia pages and so on. They'll give us shortcuts to say what Marxism, what Gandhi is, or what this is, or what that is. And very often, in fact, more often than not, those shortcuts and simplifications miss the critical parts of thinking, the nuances of dialectical thinking. Marx, right, I've said this before, I'm sure you've heard me say it before, the most important sociologist, most important social scientist there ever was. You can go into this in huge detail if you want, but I'll save you. Can you think of a single book more important than Das Kapital? Like a sociology book that made more than half the world change its political system and the other half of the world to try and stop them, right? Going to war, killing millions of people just because they wanted to live life as communists, all drawn from this one book written by a sociologist. And no other sociologists have had such readership. In fact, no other author. The only books I could think of that even are comparable to the influence of Das Kapital are the Bible and the Quran. And they don't have a single author, right? Well, Marx, Capital has two authors in a sense, Marx and Engels, although Marx wrote that one, but Engels was supporting him. So, I mean, can you think of any other important scholarly texts that have had such influence? I think of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex for feminism, but not that big. Big, but not important, but not that big. Or Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams, psychoanalysis, very important, very big, but not so that one half of the world took up the ideas and the other half of the world tried to stop that half of the world taking up the ideas. But Marx is not just some single book figure. It's not like the Bible or the Quran. Marx is not a single idea. And he was one who changed his mind many times. And in fact, his whole life can be seen as dialectical thinking. Right? So he writes the manifesto with Engels in 1847, and within 6 months they are fighting a revolutionary war, and then they are defeated. The war is the workers of 1848 are defeated. Marx goes back to the library to work out what happened. And he writes an analysis of how it was that Napoleon Bonaparte was able to mobilize the bourgeois forces against the workers and sideline them and defeat them. Then, so he writes the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte in 1852, the analysis of the 48 uprising. Looking for an uprising every 10 years because a crisis means an uprising, Marx and Engels had expected something around the financial crisis that hit Germany in 1856, but there was no political movement, at least not in Europe. Marx goes back to the library or to Hansard. He actually notices that there is a revolutionary upsurge, but it's not in Europe, it's in India, where the first nationwide rebellion is going on. And he writes on that. But that shows that really to understand the nature of crises, he needs again to go back to the library, and he does. And he writes the Grundrisse, the first draft of Capital in 1857-58, and doesn't publish it, actually, because then starts to follow the events of the Civil War in America. He writes to Lincoln, right? He writes a letter to Lincoln. Lincoln's secretary writes back. Lincoln fighting the Civil War in America, the Civil War in America being about the competition between two parts of capital, basically between wage labor and slave labor for the rest of America, the West of America. They're opening up the West of America, and the issue is, will capitalism in the West of America be based on slavery or based on wages? And Marx is, of course, on the side of the more progressive of the two. Of course, he wants to abolish the wages system as well, but in the context, wages system is better than slavery system. And so all that is going on, so he has to rewrite. Right? So he's interrupted his writing by getting involved in politics, but he interrupts being involved in politics with writing and research because he has to work out what's going on, and he rewrites Capital. He writes actually between 63 and 66, volume 1, 2, and 3 of Capital. But then Capital Volume 1 is published in 1867, and yet by 1872 he's rewriting it yet again because the research and writing was affected by another uprising, 1871, the Paris Commune, Communards. And so he then rewrites Capital, and he writes it for the French working class. It's changed, very, very significantly changed. So the version of Capital that we read based on the German edition doesn't include everything from the last published edition that Marx produced, which is the French edition in 1875. So there's this dialectical process of writing, getting involved in political action, interrupting that with more research and writing, interrupting that with political engagement. After Capital, he gets involved in the International Working Men's Association. Anyway, that history is by the by. The rewriting of Capital with the French working class in mind is really significant. He was wanting to make his ideas communicable to those that could use them for their own situation, not as a blueprint, but as a tool for understanding, critical thinking about the situation they're in. Gandhi too was very pleased to report his changing ideas, that he changed his ideas. He says, I make no hobgoblin of consistency. Very interesting that he uses the word hobgoblin because the first translated edition of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto in English, which would have been the version that Gandhi might have read, says for the line, a spectre is haunting Europe, ein Gespenst geht in Europa, auf Deutsch, in German. It translates as not a spectre, but a hobgoblin is stomping around Europe, and the hobgoblin of capitalism. So it's really curious that Gandhi uses that term. I don't know, haven't found out yet for sure if he read that edition of the manifesto. He makes no hobgoblin of consistency though. If he can be true to himself moment to moment, that's all that matters. Be true to yourself moment to moment. If that means there are inconsistencies you have to face, they're flung in your face, well, big deal. Bipin Chandra has said about the Gandhian strategy. The Gandhian strategy is struggle, truce, compromise, struggle. This strategy, both non-violent and struggle, truce, struggle, was adopted not because it was a bourgeois strategy, but because it was suited to a multi-class mass movement against the semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian, hegemonic British colonial state. In that context, it's important, or most important, Bipin Chandra now saw Gandhiji as a brilliant leader of a popular movement who, far from being bourgeois or non-revolutionary, played and understood the need to play a critical role in ensuring that the class adjustment that was necessary in a multi-class movement would happen in India, increasingly in favour of the poor. If you have a multi-class movement, when that movement wins, then the old class hierarchy is likely to be reasserted. And we can actually see that in India, that the post-colonial elite was the old business class that had sided with Gandhi and supported him. But Gandhi's effort was continually to flatten that hierarchy within the movement by stressing the the Harijans, the lower castes, fighting in favour of the oppressed. And it's an important strategy that everyone be drawn into the political movement, and that the dictatorship of the proletariat be of the proletariat, not by a few business leaders pretending for a while to be proletarian. On cotton, or khadi, another similarity, but well, it's a very big focus. For Marx, the focus on a coat is all important. But for Gandhi, as you see from the stamps, the idea of homespun cotton is really a hugely revolutionary and significant aspect of his thinking. For Marx, the significance of a coat is run all the way through Capital. He's obsessed by the making of a coat. If you have 20 yards of linen and that's worth however much value, then add to that linen some tailoring and then sell it as a coat, it's worth so much more. Where did the profit come from? From the time the difference between the time for which the tailor is paid and for which the tailor produces value. And of course, the owner of the manufactory takes that value. So all through Capital, this linen and this coat is referred to. And that's the equivalent then, for me, the comparative moment is the famous photographs of Gandhiji sitting at his chakra spinning, right? The image that's reproduced on the money, on stamps, commemorative cups, you name it. Just one of these symbolic points of convergence between Marx and Gandhi. I'd pair it with when Marx got his haircut in Algeria, the way he told Engels was to say that he's shorn off, he's shorn away his beard, and he's taken off the horrendous greatcoat, his great coat, right? So his rhinoceros greatcoat, he called it. So he's thinking always about this coat. It's almost symbolic of him. And why? Because, God. The first political engagements that Marx had were with the struggles of the Silesian weavers, so to do with cotton. And their struggle for adequate conditions against the new industrial machinery that was bringing in new styles of weaving. And, in Capital, he also talks about the Luddites who smashed the new weaving frames that were introduced that made them work harder for less, basically. Gandhi's first entry into politics in India after returning from South Africa was an intervention on behalf, with the issues of farmers in Champaran in Bihar, who were forced by indigo planters to grow indigo and opium without remuneration in place of cotton or rice, in place of food. So Marx's interest in the weavers, in their very same weavers in Bihar, features in Capital when he quotes the Viceroy in the Times, or the British Governor General in the Times, lamenting that the bones of the cotton weavers were bleaching in the plains of Bihar. This similarity is not accidental because, of course, it's the weavers that at that time were the most exploited class of labourers under Capital. So a student of technologies and textiles could start with weaving, and it wouldn't be frivolous to consider Marx's study of the impact of the sewing machine as well on domestic labour in this context. Gandhi also writes of the sewing machine, and he makes two interesting associations. First of all, he's thinking of the effort to introduce homespun cotton. That's his strategy against British imports of cotton. Right? The British had exported cotton from the Americas or during the Civil War from India, and they had produced cheaper materials to sell then in India, wiping out the livelihoods of local weavers and the cotton industry in what had been before then the most effective and efficient and beautiful of industries, cotton and silk industries in India. Anyway, Gandhi says, I know there are friends who laugh at the attempt to revive the great art of spinning. They remind me that in these days of mills, sewing machines and typewriters, only a lunatic can hope to succeed in reviving the rusticated spinning wheel. These friends forget that the needle has not yet given place to the sewing machine, nor has the hand lost its cunning despite the typewriter. Very interesting to associate weaving with writing. Really interesting as I think of Lord Levi-Strauss and Derrida on writing. 10 years later, in 1929, Gandhi applauds the labour-saving device of the sewing machine, the Singer sewing machine, and he praises Mr. Singer, who invents that machine out of love after seeing his wife slaving over needle and thread. Asked if this invention then does not imply a factory and industrial labour to produce sewing machines, Gandhi replies, but I am a socialist. I am socialist enough to say that such factories should be nationalised or state-controlled, not for profit but for the benefit of humanity, love taking the place of greed as the motive. It's the alteration of the conditions of labour that I want. This mad rush for wealth must cease. This is exactly what Marx is saying in Volume 3 of Capital, that the profit from the industrial process, the factory process, must be used for the uplift of all. The sewing machine is key to how Marx gets into looking at reproduction, costs of reproduction in the family. On the oppressed, Marx, as Iqbal Ahmed, the journalist, reports the obvious. He focused our attention on the poor and the working class. And as Chandra pointed out, Gandhi's role in bringing the popular movement in favour of the oppressed was key to his politics. Gandhiji's emphasis on working among the masses, and especially the untouchables, was key. In a period when no one else had come around to taking up the cause of these sections, the Gandhian nationalists, in their own way, initiated and kept up the resistance. For comparative research on unemployment, this is stuff they haven't done yet, but there's scope for much more work saying they are similar. Marx's Capital lays stress on the precarious worker, the soon-to-be unemployed, right? The floating, latent and lumpen, the latent, floating and stagnant reserve army of labour. On the village, Marx always was interested in communal ownership of lands. His knowledge first was derived from Hegel, see Spivak's book on that, and increasingly from reading Maine, Lubbock, and ethnographers, as well as the Bengal Hakuru, a daily newspaper, a weekly newspaper. On unity, consider what Gandhi offers in terms of Hindu-Muslim unity, all India radio, and then think, Marx, workers of the world unite. It's not just how a discussion of, it's not just a discussion of tolerance. It goes to the heart of what India will become, or what it has become. Gandhi's statue is being blindfolded in Gujarat now. See the essay by Rao in 2011. Poignant, given what also happened to statues of Marx after the fall of sausage and three-veg communism in Europe. Another similarity on opium. In his 1844 discussion of Hegel, Marx had said the criticism of religion is a prerequisite of all criticism. Now Gandhi was big on religion too. On Marx, we kind of have got the wrong end of the stick on religion, often. One of his most famous quips is from the essay where he says, and you've probably heard it, religion is the opium of the people. And if you only take that slogan and think that that's Marx, religion is the opium of the people, you don't understand well enough. And you have to expand the quote to see what he was talking about. And I've got the larger quote here. Open up the quote and read the lines that give context to that phrase. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed preacher, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So he's not saying religion is counter-revolutionary. It's like the first step and needs to be, and it's a dependency, sure. You need to go further than only moan about oppression. Gandhi was not on a dissimilar track when in Hind Swaraj he was castigating the comprador class using an analogy with cannabis. Who assisted the company's officers? Who was tempted at the sight of their silver? Who brought their goods? History testified that we all did this. In order to become rich all at once, we welcomed the company's officers with open arms. We assisted them. If I'm in the habit of drinking bhang is yogurt with hashish oil in it, and the seller thereof sells to me, am I to blame him or myself? At one point, Gandhi says salt is also an addiction, and salt was banned by the British, or manufacture of salt was banned by the British, so they could have a monopoly of selling it, in the same way they had a monopoly of opium. Indirectly guilty of poisoning natives with liquor sold illegally and stupefying Indian miners by selling them opium is contravention of the law. And yet, it was the East India Company that grew opium in India. And not only did they grow all the opium in India, it was forbidden for anyone to, any East India Company person to market opium, but anyone who did market opium had to market East India Company opium. And they were then selling it to China and to Vietnam. You can still today go and visit the opium manufactory, number 74 Hai Ba Chung Road, and see the now renovated lovely French colonial restaurant that used to be the opium factory. And you can still tell that it's there because in the archway, you look up the where the glass windows would have been, the metal, what's the word for this? Glass window? Coloured glass window. Anyway, the metal ornamental design for the archway of the door is the shape of an opium poppy. Anyway, it was the manufactory for opium. In Hind Swaraj, in his book, 1909, Gandhi says of opium, an ignorant mother may from purest motives administer a dose of opium to her child. Her motives will not cure her of her ignorance, nor in the moral world purge her of her offence. Did Gandhi know that Marx had said something similar with regard to women who gave their children Godfrey's cordial, a kind of opiate given to children by their mothers who had to keep the kids quiet while they worked in the factory? Marx is citing the 6th report of